October 1949, victory celebrations in Beijing. Over 30 years after the Soviet Revolution, communism makes a second great advance. The country with the largest population in the world now has a communist government.
After thousands of years of struggle, we were liberated at last. What a joy.
The crowds in Tiananmen Square hear Mao Zedong proclaim a new start. Mao says China will now be free of inequality, poverty, and foreign domination. From now on, 1/5 of the world's people will become part of the greatest experiment in mass mobilization ever attempted. For the first half of the 20th century, most Chinese still lived in a way that hadn't altered for generations. 4 out of 5 worked on the land in desperate poverty. Most were in debt to landowners or moneylenders. In the west of China, Hu Binchu's family were landless laborers.
It was a hard life. We had very little to live on. I wove cloth day and night to make ends meet. We could only just scrape by. In the past, there was justice for the rich, but none for the poor. Who cared about us then? Nobody. You can't believe how badly the poor were treated.
President Chiang Kai-shek re-established a central government. His nationalist party drew support from Chinese businessmen and the landowners in the countryside. Foreigners were allowed to keep their privileged hold over trade and finance. And the nationalists believed that in time, capitalism would spread its wealth out to the other China, beyond Shanghai and the coastal cities. But the gulf between the lives of the middle class and the mass of peasants and laborers remained as wide as ever. As China began to industrialize, low wages and poor conditions increased the social divide. Some looked to China's Communist Party for a radical change that could take China out of its lethargy and end its exploitation by foreigners. Starting in Shanghai, the communists attempted to stir up the city's factory workers. The communists were savagely suppressed by Chiang Kai-shek's forces from the late 1920s. Those who weren't purged were driven out of the cities and pursued across China. After the historic Long March, they reached the remote northwest. From the caves of Yan'an, their leader, Mao Zedong, planned a new kind of revolution that would spring from the countryside more than the workers in the city. In a short time, he said, several 100 million peasants will rise like a tornado or a tempest. The communists and nationalists had cooperated, albeit uneasily, during Japan's invasion of China. But when the Second World War ended, a full-scale civil war between the two sides resumed. Mao promised the peasants land reform, and his troops treated them well.
When the soldiers first came to our village, I was really scared of them. I didn't even dare sleep in my room. They told me they were the People's Liberation Army and that I shouldn't be frightened. They slept in the street and were extremely well behaved.
By the autumn of 1949, the communists had driven the nationalists out of all the major cities. They fled to the island of Taiwan, taking the country's gold reserves with them. And Mao Zedong took over a bankrupt and devastated country. He promised a China that could stand on its own feet alongside the other world powers. Mao's thought and the mass line were to be the foundation for a purer, fairer, more progressive Marxist state than the one that had emerged in the Soviet Union. It was to be a revolution in which the peasants were to take the leading role. Activists would explain the ideas of class identity and class struggle to every village and workplace and incite the peasants to speak up against the enemy. Traveling projection teams took films to the remotest areas, bringing the message of active socialism. As the revolutionary program started, the peasants were the first to benefit. They were granted the land reform they'd wanted for so long. It was the party's plan that they should seem to make the change themselves. In a pattern that would be repeated again and again, speak bitterness meetings were staged. The landlords and others linked to the defeated nationalists were confronted.
We were told to get together and ask the landlords to return land to us. We stated how much they should return and how they should return it. There was a denunciation meeting every day.
Local party secretary Luo Shifa helped whip up feeling in his village.
The first thing we had to do was to bring down the landlords. What we did was to persuade the tenant farmers to denounce them. At the public meeting, they would explain how they couldn't afford to pay back the rent every year, or how they had to take out high-interest loans to pay it off. People around the stage sympathized with the poor peasants' stories, and they'd weep.
政府接受了群众的要求，判决罪犯李志仁的死刑，坚决与人民为敌的反革命分子一定受到人民严厉的制裁。
Hundreds of thousands were killed.
经过轰轰烈烈的土地改革，他们的苦日子从此一去不回头了。今天他们真正的翻身做了土地的主人。
The class warfare was less vicious in the cities. The communists tried to win the support of the managers and technicians the revolution needed to keep the mills and plants running, and to assimilate the capitalist owners who had not left with the nationalists. propaganda showed businessmen handing the deeds of their companies over to the state, and then celebrating with improbable glee the new socialist dawn. The Jin family in Shanghai decided it was best to cooperate. Mrs. Jin took part in a film explaining her new outlook to other wives.
金锦芝在小组会上说，过去丈夫不能掌握自己的命运，做妻子的命运更是没有保障。大家走上社会主义的光明大道，就可以放心了。
After liberation, the communists didn't like businesses like my husband's, so he was in trouble. Then we studied the party's policies and decided that joint ownership with the state was the only solution.
The changeover could be bloody. Qi Yo-yi worked at a Beijing factory.
The big bosses in our factory were executed immediately. The less important ones were forced to reform through hard labor. We were asked to keep an eye on them. We hated them so much, we beat them if they didn't work hard enough. That's the way they treated us. In the past, they'd been the masters. Now we were.
Women were given new rights at work and in marriage. The painful tradition of foot binding was abolished. And women were helped in the drive to end illiteracy. Gao Yu-ying from a village near Beijing was first a pupil and then a teacher.
Once I'd learned how, I could teach others to read. I didn't have a blackboard, so I used a wooden door. I wrote words on it and they copied them. Some of them had their babies with them, breastfeeding and studying at the same time. I can tell you it was really hard.
创造出了许多好办法。这种每人一块小黑板的学习方法，当他们去地里干活的时候，就把自己的小黑板插在地头上，结合生产劳动来熟读生字，真正做到了学以致用。
Lin County in Henan was an arid plain blocked off by mountains. The 3,000 kilometers long Red Flag Canal was planned to bring in water over the rocky terrain. The canal workers were celebrated as revolutionary heroes. Worked on the rock face.
I'd tie a rope around my body and swing out in the air. I used a pick to remove the loose stones. When they fell, I had to try hard to keep out of the way.
Accidents were frequent. Zhen Yangchung was sent to clear up afterwards. But the canal took twice as many people and far longer to build than expected.
Initially, there were 30,000 on the project. The plan was that if each person built 1 meter, the canal would be completed in 1 or 2 months. But it was all much more difficult, because the canal was halfway up a mountain. In the end, it took 10 years to complete.
In the Great Leap Forward's most ambitious goal, Chinese were told production of steel also had to double in 1 year. And instead of producing this just from heavy industry, the energy and goodwill of the peasants was to be mobilized again. Small furnaces were built in villages and backyards across the country. They collected any scrap they could find. He Jinhua had never made steel before, but used her ingenuity.
When we built our own furnaces, it was hard to reinforce them. Earth on its own wasn't strong, but we didn't have enough straw. I had a long pigtail, so I cut it off and snipped it into short pieces and mixed it with the earth in the furnace wall. Many of the other women cut off their hair as well.
He Jinhua's husband, Yan Tianyun, also filmed at the time, was just as keen.
The two of us competed really hard. If my team produced 3 tons of steel a shift, their team would make over 3 tons. And then I would encourage my team to think of ways to beat that.
After Mao's death, his closest associates, the Gang of Four, were arrested and charged with throwing the country into chaos. His most cherished ideas were abandoned. His successor, Deng Xiaoping, tried to replace ideology with economics. The Chinese were to be mobilized not by dreams of equality, but by money. In the 1980s, political control was as tight as ever. But the slogan from the top was, "To get rich is glorious." One legacy of Mao's reliance on popular action remained. During the Cultural Revolution, he'd allowed the students to challenge authority and feel a new sense of liberation. After Mao, the state always knew that the people, once they'd learned how, might try to challenge the party's authority again. And their fears were to be borne out on Tiananmen Square in 1989.